Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Welcome to our event, Palestinian Workers Under Occupation, A View from Within, featuring our keynote speaker. We're very happy, very excited to have him here. Imad Tameza is here. He joins us direct from Palestine. Please give him a warm keynote welcome. Among many other things, Imad is one of the co-founders of Palestinian Postal Workers Union and is a member of the Palestinian BDS, Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions National Committee. We'll be providing more details about his work in terms of introduction. This event is one of 5 that is being held across Canada as part of a speaking tour. It has been organized by Labor for Palestine here in Toronto. The host of the event is Faculty for Palestine and the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid. This international solidarity tour is a monumental achievement, and its success speaks to the long-standing ties of solidarity and connections that have been built between labor unions, social justice organizations, students, faculty, teachers, and workers in Palestine and here in Canada and Turtle Island, including a widespread movement across Canada since 2006. You're going to hear some details about that, including centers of work around this in Halifax, Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg. Imad Tameza, our special guest, will be speaking about the multiple levels of oppression that Palestinian workers face in the Palestinian territories occupied by Israel, including the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. This is incredibly important in the current context as Israel's intensification of the occupation escalates and as it continues to expand its violent and racist apartheid regime against indigenous Palestinians. And before we begin with the panel, we're going to ask a couple of invited guests to give some greetings to our brother who's visiting here from Palestine. So I'd ask Issam Al Yamani, longtime Palestinian activist, community organizer, and friend of many in the room across the GTA, to bring forward a greeting if one wants to come up.
In such events, I cannot but remember a great Canadian, great labor unionist, Joe Flixer. At any event of labor union, I have to mention Joe Flixer, who was one of the first or the pioneer activists who pushed the Palestinian issue into the Canadian labor movement, and he is the one behind making CLC invite a Palestinian labor movement to the CLC convention in Montreal under Bob White and Sherry Carr. So I have to mention his name. We all know the hardship the Palestinian labor movement faces in Palestine. They have to struggle in 2 dimensions, in 2 fronts. They have to struggle against the Israeli apartheid. At the same time, they have to struggle for the social issues of the labor workers or the Palestinian workers under a corrupted authority, where this authority is aligned with Palestinian capitalists. And I don't want to take much of Imad's speech. I welcome you, Imad, in Toronto, and thank you for coming.
Against Israeli Apartheid, Faculty for Palestine, to do a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. On behalf of Kaya and FRP, the organizing committees for this speaking tour, which was made possible by Labor for Palestine, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee as the original keepers of this land where this event is being held. We think it is important, in fact urgent, that as we hear about and discuss the effects of colonization of Palestinian lands, we also acknowledge the effects of colonization of indigenous lands across Turtle Island, including in the political entity we know as the state of Canada, and in fact I would say perhaps especially. Our work here tonight is in the spirit of global left, radical, labor, anti-capitalist solidarity traditions, and I'm glad that Issam mentioned Joe Flexer and those kinds of legacies that he helped bring forward. And it's grounded in these traditions that are grounded in commitments to decolonization, anti-racism, and freedom for all people. This means that any truly transformative solidarity work taking place in Canada, Turtle Island today must acknowledge and seek to end white supremacy in all its forms. Not least the frequently unacknowledged but nonetheless very real international contract of white solidarity that binds the nations of Canada and Israel and the United States and beyond. Our work then includes very urgently dismantling the nation-state system that is rooted in European settler histories of racist colonial violence towards Indigenous peoples here and globally, colonization of Indigenous lands, and the ongoing and foundational violence of slavery that continues today, including in the form of virulent and widespread anti-Black racism against peoples historically and currently dispossessed of and displaced from their original lands and denied access to freedom and safety in the lands and places landed upon them and living in, and which they've been living in since. This also includes fundamentally dismantling the ongoing institutionalized racist anti-immigrant policies, anti-migrant policies, practices and laws that exist and continue to proliferate violence across the globe today. The nation states which call themselves Canada and Israel, we share with Israel parallel racist colonial histories that are deeply rooted in and invested in destroying and displacing Indigenous peoples from their original land and from denying access to equal or any rights or freedoms to racialized peoples more generally. Finally, we want to acknowledge an important event that reverberated through Palestine this last week when Palestinian political prisoner Khalida Jarrar, a fierce freedom fighter for Indigenous and anti-racist justice for Palestinians, was released from an Israeli prison a few days ago after 20 months in jail, and that wasn't her first time. Khalida's daughters, Yafa and Suha, who many of us in this room know, went to school with, have struggled with in our Palestinian struggles, and many others, are both equally fierce activists in the BDS movement, and in fact created much space in the BDS movement for these kinds of events today. In acknowledging our joy at the release of Khalida Jarrar, we are simultaneously acknowledging all of the thousands and thousands of Palestinian political prisoners still in Israeli jails, all of the thousands and thousands of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island for whom prison or the threat of it on their lives is a constant struggle, to quote Angela Davis. And all of the Black lives and undocumented migrants here and globally that matter, and who face extreme forms of racism, including political imprisonment and forms of legal apartheid with impunity here on this land every day. And finally, we acknowledge our struggle in solidarity with those Palestinians here in Canada who live daily with the threat of removal from this land on grounds fabricated by the Canadian state. And I want to just note particularly the current struggle of Issam Al Yamani, who was up here earlier, who is, we have a defense committee working with Issam to make sure that he is not deported by this Canadian state who calls itself the best friend of Israel. So this is our struggle. We know that a lot of the struggle has been built through labor. We know that land is the issue, and many other things, many other power relations are the issue that we need to keep fighting about, and this is an important event for us to connect and hear from Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jo. So we're going to start our panel discussion, and I'm going to ask Liisa Schofield to come and join us at the front. Liisa is a Canadian Union of Postal Workers an organizer, and she's a member of QP 1979, Local 1979, and also a member of Labor for Palestine. Liisa will provide some context to Union solidarity history on Labor for Palestine following the 2005 call from Palestine for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And she's going to speak for about 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Ilian. Hello, everyone. How are you? Good. Doing well? Okay. So there's many other people in this room that were part of CUPE International Solidarity Committee at the time. So I'm hoping that when we get to discussion, they will speak up. I was one member of a very large and vibrant crew of people in around 2005 and onward. So Ilian being one of them, Catherine being another, there's many others in the room that are here. So I hope they will help me out with that. So I was just going to go through a little bit of the history, as Ilian said, after the 2005 boycott, divestment, and sanctions call from the Boycott National Committee in Palestine, signed by over 170 civil society organizations in Palestine at the time. So this call went out internationally in 2005, and we responded in Canada. We had a newly formed coalition against Israeli apartheid, and we were just beginning our organizing at the time. And we responded with beginning to see how can we push this BDS call within Canada and within Ontario specifically. So astoundingly, one of the first things that happened in response to that call was a resolution going to the CUPE Ontario Convention in May of 2006. And there was quite a lot of lead up to that, and there was a lot of activists on the ground organizing to make that happen, getting different locals to endorse it, getting CUPE Toronto District Council to endorse it, getting CUPE International Solidarity Committee to endorse it, and then bringing it to CUPE Ontario Convention. Then there was the efforts to actually get it to hit the floor on convention, which is its own hilarious story, which people can tell that story. But it did hit the floor as an emergency resolution, and it passed over 900 delegates in attendance at the time. And so this was a historic moment for BDS internationally. This was the first union of this size to pass a resolution. CUPE Ontario being the largest part of CUPE nationally, the largest aspect of CUPE nationally. So we were the largest union to pass a resolution anywhere in the world at the time. It was quite significant. And the context of the resolution, the other thing that was astounding was the actual wording of the resolution, which I just want to read out because this was crafted quite carefully you can tell it was crafted by organizers who could see what they wanted to accomplish with this resolution. So I just want to read it out. And I dug up some of my old materials, which I'm happy for people to take a look at. And I can pass around, but please give it back to me because that's my only copy. So Resolution 50. With Palestine Solidarity and Human Rights organizations, develop an education campaign about the apartheid nature of the Israeli and the Israeli state and the political and economic support of Canada for these practices. 2, support the international campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions until Israel meets its obligation to recognize the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and fully complies with the precepts of international law, including the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So people who know organizing around this issue know that that in particular is very groundbreaking. 3, call on the National Union to commit to research into Canadian involvement in the occupation and call on the CLC to join us in lobbying against the apartheid-like practices of the Israeli state, call for the immediate dismantling of the wall. And then the justification of the resolution reads, because the Israeli apartheid wall has been condemned and determined illegal under international law, and because over 170 Palestinian political parties, unions, and other organizations, including the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions, issued a call in July 2005 for a global campaign of BDS against Israel, similar to those imposed against South African apartheid. And because QPBC has firmly and vocally condemned the occupation of Palestine and have initiated an education campaign about the apartheid-like practices of the Israeli state. So that's the text of the resolution, which was very groundbreaking at a time and set a very important precedent internationally for if we are going to start pushing this politic in our unions, this is the bar, this is where we start, which was quite amazing at the time. Sorry.
When was that resolution passed?
May 27th, 2006. Yeah, so it was quite soon after, on the heels of of 2005. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, there was quite a lot of backlash against CUPE Ontario passing this resolution. Saying the term apartheid at the time, calling Israel an apartheid state at the time was quite controversial. It wasn't as easy, or I'm not saying it's easy today, but it wasn't as easy as it is today. So there was quite a lot of backlash against the union. There was quite a lot of attempts to co-opt different aspects of the union, threats of some people disaffiliating, that kind of thing happening at the time. We stood strong, and I think the Ontario district stood strong in defense of the resolution and spoke out publicly in favor of it. And we had developed a rank and file education committee mostly through the International Solidarity Committee, but also from other locals. And we had that rank and file education committee ready to go. And so what we did, because the resolution called for education of our membership, it gave us access to membership to talk about the issues, which was probably one of the most important parts of the resolution, to keep it alive and keep the backlash from burying it. So we brought our rank and file committee together. We developed our education materials, which is this booklet that we put out. And then we started to ask locals and councils to invite us to their meetings to do a presentation. So we did a train the trainers, and Ilian will remember because we did it together many times. But we had to, we didn't get a lot of pickup initially from locals saying, yes, please come out and talk to us about this extremely controversial issue. So we had to have, people calling and following up and meeting people and saying, this is why we think your members need to hear about this. And it gave us access to membership like I think we've never had before. It was quite amazing at the time and really quite democratic, and I think important for the union to take that position, and important for us as rank and file activists to be involved in that. And it gave us access to more people to involve in the organizing. So that rolled out in about January of 2007 and continued for many months, doing education across the province in as many places as we could. And we continued to build quite a lot of momentum into 2008 when there was the attacks on Gaza. And that was around that time in 2008 was when CUPW passed a resolution, a BDS resolution. And that was the next major union to pass a resolution, and the first national union to do so, and was also very historic.
Well, 5 minutes, more or less.
Okay, thank you.
No problem, no problem.
I am happy to wrap up any moment. And so those were the two kind of major unions that were pushing this in Canada. And then there was quite a lot of silence from the other unions. There was certainly silence from CLC. There was certainly silence from a lot of the other national unions for many years. There were some statements around Gaza, but there really wasn't as much teeth in it as we've seen in both CUPE and CPW. There was, sorry, I'm just gonna read my notes. I think one of the important messages we put out there that I feel like in our rank and file education committee and going around the province and talking to workers themselves, one of the most powerful lines that I think we put out there that had the most pickup, which maybe, Ilian, maybe you came up with, I don't remember, or maybe it was Rafif or Adam, was Palestinian workers have set up a picket line, and it's our responsibility as workers to respect that picket line. And that was the most powerful image for people to conjure up. So most recently, there have been some resolutions from Unifor Canada Council, which I'm not sure the teeth behind it. I'm not quite sure where it came. It came out of the Oshawa local, actually, and quite powerful that it came out of the Oshawa local, given what the Oshawa local is under right now. And there was this past summer a delegation from CUPE National and CLC itself to Palestine, which I think is quite telling and quite powerful. I think will show fruit beyond this delegation. And there were also delegations I know from, Abdi, did you go on the delegation with CUPW to Palestine? Dave went, yeah. Yeah, so there was a delegation of postal workers also to Palestine soon after passing the resolution. So I think, just to wrap up, I think we continue to have, Labor for Palestine information. I think that some momentum has been lost in recent years, if I'm to be honest. And I think struggling to find ways to pick that momentum back up and push our unions to take more action. And I think where we struggle is a lot in how do we actualize the resolutions, and it requires a ton of work of rank and file activists to make this happen. In our unions, we're not, sometimes we get support from leadership and sometimes we don't, right? And so it requires a ton of backup work from rank and file activists. So I think for me the question is, how do we actualize resolutions into solidarity actions like we saw under South African apartheid? So where we saw people refusing to unload South African goods from shipping containers, or where we saw postal workers refusing to touch mail coming from South Africa. How do we start to actualize our resolutions to go in that direction? So I think I'll leave it at there.